using the template of whatever I started to say when all that before this broke loose. In the city, those who believe they can't do something can't. You could look at ordinary consciousness as being a kind of weighted contrast. That is, the belief that out of the binary sampling, that one, in any particular case, from one particular view, that one is better, more correct, true, more truer, and thus there is a feeling that in each and every binary sampling that there should be, or there is, a weighted contrast. Now, between Kyroot and myself, I have in the last few weeks pointed out several things, such as in the city, only people who believe they have a soul have one. And if I recall, it got a couple of snickers. Some of you still wired up enough that you can't resist anything that has any reference to spiritual matters, especially if apparently Kyroots pokes a little fun at them. But the idea that man has some soul, not just a sense of time-wise of it being eternal, but something special, that man is not simply an ape that can drive a car and do mathematics and speak, that there is this indefinable spark of divinity of some kind, a soul. And I would suspect that most of you by now that have been around the bushes here for a while would expect Kyroots and yours truly to probably ignore, if not laugh at, apparently, the idea of a soul. But it was not meant just as a joke. You were just being set up so that somewhere down the line, to wit tonight, I could bring it back up. So what Kyroots was saying was that there is a soul in some cases. As far as I can make out of what he said, if we take what he said and assume he meant no more and no less, some people actually have a soul, whatever they believe it is. But the only ones who've got it are those who believe they got it. Now, if that be true, that is not a play on words, and I'm not being funny. It is staggering in its consequences. Tonight, Kyroots pointed out that, again, many of you would probably have expected something else to be said, but he pointed out that in the city, sin does exist. There is such a thing as sin, but only for those who believe in it. I repeat, at least you think this is some form of verbal byplay, you could say, well, in that case, all you're saying is that if you, say, went to college or got away from the farm and your family and found out that if you do go to bed with some woman or man that's not your lawful spouse, or if you smoke marijuana, that you don't die. And therefore you become liberated and you take at least 1 or 2 quarters in philosophy and you decide, hell, there ain't no God. Or if there is, he ain't Catholic. And you feel greatly relieved. And if I can take that and stick it on top of what Kyroots said, then all I got to do is quit believing in sin. You know, assuming that there's some cosmic significance to this, you're saying if I quit believing in sin, that there is no sin. Wow, that's great. What a great theory. What a wonderful philosophy. You can't theorize about it. You can't rhapsodize about it. When it gets down to it, you got to live the son of a bitch. Ordinary people cannot decide somewhere in midstream. That is, while they're alive. They cannot decide, wait a minute, I don't have a soul. It was this fallacious religion in which my family raised me that made me believe that. Now, if you believe that life made you believe anything, hell, you'll believe anything. If you think it's the Baptist church or the Catholics or your family or culture that made you believe anything, crap, you'll believe anything twice. No, people believe they have a soul. As soon as they hear it, they believe it. It's not just Catholics that sin. As soon as everybody hears about sin, and at least a comment that goes right after it about, and we've all done so, everybody falls on the floor internally and goes, yea, yea, verily, verily, hear ye. Ordinary people cannot decide, I don't have a soul, and therefore I don't have one. or there is no such thing as sin, I no longer believe in sin, therefore it's impossible for me to sin. That is not the way that's put together. You've got to find slot A and slot B, or tab B, and then you've got to be able to ignore it, because if it fits, you're not doing it. The conflict between such questions as, does man have a soul, does man not have a soul? Is there such thing as sin? All of these conflicts are not actually over whether the samples involved are true, more true, correct, less correct. The conflict is simply to show Mr. Charlie that the work goes on. Anytime you complain, anytime you speak up for goodness, and of course many other people speak up for non-goodness, the rat-ass bastards, I can't help it, it's the way life is, but anytime you do it, what you're doing is you're notifying the boss that the work is continuing. No need to bring out the whips, no need to bring out the chains. It's like raising your hand out in the midst of the field while everyone's stooped over and you're saying, it's all going on. No problem, we could not be working more diligently. Recently somebody sent me a question asking about the area of faith healing. And so I'll stick it in right here. They also seem to believe that somewhere along the line I had inferred or stated that faith healing didn't exist, which obviously is not true, because everything exists if it's ever been talked about. But that perhaps I had said that it didn't work. If it exists, it works. But this is, believe it or not, an opportune time to bring this in. That apparently faith healing takes place. That's what the person who wrote the question. And I assume that some of you have either thought it did or wondered whether it did or whatnot. Hell yeah, it takes place. For those who believe in it. If you don't believe in it, it don't work. If someone is healed, if someone actually had a tumor, something physically showing, and they said, I believe that you can heal me, Reverend so-and-so, Dr. so-and-so, Professor so-and-so, Mr. Charlie, and somebody says, well, I'm going to say a magic formula, and I'm going to put my little sweaty palm on your thing, and it'll go away, and they do it, and you stand and you look. With your seeing molecules, you look, and it goes zzz, and disappears. Like a Walter Lantz cartoon. Disney couldn't have done it better, it just disappears, and you saw it. And you're going to tell me that doesn't work? Sure it works. But it only works if you believe it. But that doesn't mean that it exists or it doesn't exist. Unless you're going to believe that you can fake it. That is, either fake believing it when you don't, or vice versa. Then the person also asks something along these lines, if there is any validity to faith healing, could one use it on oneself? Now we are apparently getting somewhere, apparently. Can you not believe in a soul if you believe that you have one? Can you not believe in sin if you believe that there is sin? If you doubt that in some way you can be healed through faith, now in certain parts of the city they would still classify faith healing as being an absolute spiritual thing. Those of you that read the paper as much as I do are aware of the fact that now there is some, in some parts of the city, there's some credence given to the fact that faith healing simply amounts to, back to the great contrast of mind and body, that in some strange ways that the mind, that they're not sure that they correctly understand the connection therein, but in some way the mind can make the body very likely ill, and then it can, perhaps, cure the body. I mean, they believe that they are on the verge of a major, I assume, breakthrough. If you believe, it can be done. But then your question is, what is believing? Are you still listening? In the city, they say other things. One of the things that they say is that no man's knowledge can go beyond his experience, which is unless you're absolutely tied to city consciousness, is patently fraudulent. The knowing of any knowledge is an experience. The inference being that unless you have personally experienced this something, then any knowledge, any so-called knowledge you may have of it, has got to be less than correct. It's incorrect, it's faulty, it's imperfect. It's not true. Wrong again. Absolutely wrong again. If you have ever experienced anything, what they in the city, given the binary sampling, what someone could say, well, your experience has brought you to an absolutely fallacious piece of what you call knowledge. Then half the world at any given time, half the people working out in the fields are incorrect, right? You still believe that. And you believe that this is some kind of struggle to make sure that you get on the side of the right and the correct, right? That you escape any possible stepping over into the role where all the false people, all the incorrect, all the deluded people are hanging out. Instead of picking cotton, they're pulling cotton little balls off their sweaters and trying to stick them back on plants, I assume. Now they're trying to construct some kind of little cotton ball guides. Let me repeat again. In the city, it's very common knowledge. It's stated that a man's knowledge cannot go beyond his experience, that you cannot know anything that you have not experienced. Now, of course, in the city, if you believe that, sure it's true. So what? How much would you know? How much does anyone know? That is not the point. But it cannot stand that scrutiny. But the real scrutiny it cannot stand is that the word knowledge, like every other what? Word. The idea of knowledge, like every other what? Idea. It's based upon a dual sample. That there is knowledge and then there's faulty knowledge or ignorance. Well, let's just call it faulty knowledge. That if a man believes in the city that he has knowledge and it completely goes beyond his personal experience, that knowledge does not classify as real knowledge. What kind of knowledge is it then? And the first part of this, all knowing of any knowledge, all knowing of anti-knowledge, all knowing of incorrect knowledge, the process of knowing fallacious knowledge, is an experience. It is only in the city. It is only where the people must stay in conflict for no particular reason that one group, one of the divisions, one area of the binary contrast can apparently make a meaningful, weighted statement about the other side thusly, that anyone who supports the other contrast, in a sense, is non-existent. That what you're doing doesn't exist. What you believe in doesn't exist. And it's just a matter of time until you people must wise up. What they're saying is it's only a matter of time, surely, until all contrasts are gone. Or if we were to take some of the stories that I have let be retold here in the last several weeks, it is as though life somewhere has periodic hot flashes saying, when am I going to be able to pull myself together and make one straight step ahead? When can I stop being so indecisive? When can I stop operating, at least on this level, in a binary manner? There is a way in which I could say that it's only a revolutionist that could see, that could implement external matters, including verbal matters, that have, at least in him or her, no natural internal model. Now that absolutely transcends any idea, the theories of knowledge being limited to experience, knowledge being limited to that which is correct as opposed to faulty knowledge, or experience being something that coincides with one half of the field hand's definitions and beliefs in what experience is, whereas if it does not agree, then it was some kind of pseudo-experience, that you just thought you experienced something, but since the apparent content, since the apparent activity involved does not meet our criteria, what we believe to be experience, you had a non-experience experience. Your experience was actually a non-event. In that case, let me take what I just said and reverse it for you. In the city, people cannot construct any organization, any institution, cannot formulate any idea. They cannot deal in any external matters. They cannot perceive them, picture them, implement them, unless they are a direct reflection of some internal model. No one, no group of people, no group of PhDs, hundreds, thousands, experts in any area can formulate, theorize, perceive, implement, in any way deal with an external matter for which they do not already have a natural internal model. If you are limited to that, where in the hell can you go? Assuming any of this has ever made any significant sense and affected the way you live and the way your molecules seem to operate, then you would have to ask yourself this: is there any known, at least you forget you've become accustomed to some of it, is there any to you known internal model available that sounds like this? Looked at another way, is there anything in your experience, is there anything that you've ever read about, is there anything that you've looked upon, your own investigations, the life of the city, the life of the state of ordinary man, are there any institutions, structures, buildings, organizations, ideas, theories that presently, or at any time in the past, but the past is all piling up in the present, is there anything that would lead you to believe that these are reflections of internal models? And the answer is no. If there was any basis for any of this, it would not be interesting to the people born to it. It would not be in any way useful. It would not be fresh. It would not tell you anything. And above all those actually to the bushes born, it would not be fun. In the city, respected scientists, to be a little more scientific, have another phrase, another idea that says that they will frame no hypotheses unless it be based upon personal observation, personal experience. Now, the real revolutionist realizes that the people don't really observe much of anything, regardless of what a scientist here or there can say. And the revolutionists would further realize that almost any old hypothesis, any idea that he could come up with, is as good as or better than that which is presently accepted as the law of the land, the truth. How you intend, or looking back upon your attempts, how have you intended to direct yourself, to lead yourself. But then the dual sampling that seems to be inside of each of you of I and me are the two parts of me. In what way do you attempt to give some specific direction? Heretofore you have adopted, apparently, theories piecemeal, picked up what I guess you could have tried to defend as being an enlightened, eclectic collection of all the good parts from religions and philosophies, metaphysical systems here and there. But you would be left, no matter what terminology you were using as a show, you would be left as a supporter of the scientific idea that I started this section with. That you really are framing no hypotheses that is not based upon personal observation. Anyone who really listening tonight should have noted that I did not point out the initial flaw in this. That is, unless it be based upon personal observation, as opposed to what? Well, as opposed to somebody told me about it. Oh, as long as that's not a personal observation. Well, that's something I just read in the book. Oh, well, I was afraid it was, a personal observation. I keep forgetting that scientists and people in the city can read a book without personally observing it. I mean, for a minute there, I thought that was some kind of experience. Oh, silly me, it's not. I don't think I have to point out to at least the people here right now for these opening minutes feel somewhat, they're acting as though they feel somewhat bedazzled or confused. How about the story? How about the interruption of the flash? Not the one that he mistakenly was handed for the children, but the real story. Looking for the significance. And think about those two guides, those guides. Cannot form, will not form any hypothesis, will not come up with any idea, any philosophy, as it's connotatively referred to now, unless it is based upon personal experience, personal observation. And the real revolutionist in you, the enlistee in you, the potential regular army in you, by now has got to see that the people don't really observe much of anything. They can talk about it, but what do they observe? For one thing, they've never observed the basic condition of the dual sampling, and that is that half the people working here, half the people in the city, half the people in the state of man, in any subject, believe one thing. The other half believe something else. The people do not observe anything unless the people, unless an individual here or there, realized that the specifics don't matter. That's not what is going on. Is a discussion actually concerning these two matters, such as does man have a soul or not? Does man have free will or not? Is there a God or not? That's all irrelevant. It might as well be, do they trade corn futures in Chicago or L.A.? It's the same importance. It doesn't matter as long as there's an argument. That's all that's important. Will not form any hypotheses. And the real revolutionist understands this, that he could concoct for his own reason now. We're not talking about to set up some phony baloney New Age Will Roberts tent revival, but the revolutionist himself or herself can formulate any cockamamie hypotheses, and it will as well, if not better, explain and help direct his own efforts, his own understanding, better than whatever is the accepted truth, hypotheses, philosophy, that is currently the law of the land, the lay of the land, the rule of that particular plantation, anything. There's no danger of frightening people any worse than confusing there, is there? The kid said no, so let me point out, what is it you think I do? Now, I know that sounds tacky at times, but hell, I can't resist it. Half the time in the fields must be spent in tackiness. Half the time must be tacky. Half the people who are confronted with tackiness, they get some energy from it because they don't like it. And the other half of the people laugh at it. And half the people think the other half are tacky, so why can't I use it? The real revolutionist. Don't worry about now the apparent external relationship between one person and another person or groups of people. We're talking about the internal state of you as Grunhilde or Alfonso. That any hypotheses that you could conjure up will explain, will be as perceptive as any you have ever heard of, read about. It was not too long ago that I pointed out one night that the most important thing a person ever hears is what they tell themselves. A long time before that, on several occasions, I have given this kind of example and asked you to consider it, such as, why is it that apparently everything that has any great meaning and consequence, kind of words to live by, everybody in the city gets them somewhere else? That the kinds of single sentence proverbs or maxims that keep prisoners sane and keep them from confessing, as some little comment that a general spoke to them one time in their, at least in their hearing, them and 4,500 other men, or they read in a book and they say, the only thing that kept me alive throughout these months and years of torture was just remembering it is better to die as a man on my feet than to survive on my knees as a cowardly dog. All right, the person believed in it, evidently. A form of faith healing. They say it carried them through. Okay, it carried them through. But you never find an instance in the city without the person attributing it. Proud to attribute it, always. You never hear people in the city. No one's their own hero. You never hear anybody in the city say, if they were going to say it, I'm playing with justice again and back into actors because people that could do it wouldn't be talking about it, but if they did. You never hear someone say, well, what carried me through those many trying days was I decided anybody'd capture me would eat shit, and I wouldn't tell them anything. And that kept me going. And they say, maybe by the time a reporter's about to say, I've never read that quote, who said that? I said that. By the time they shot me down, they began to capture me. I looked around at these, you know, they dress funny, they're not like me or you, they smell different. And I thought, fuck these little bastards. Anybody's got enough nerve to capture me and lock me up, I wouldn't tell them dog shit. Fuck them. And I kept that attitude. Kept me going. I said that. That's never done. Never, 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 never. And you know it. That apparently, remember I'm trying to get you to squeeze these two things together for a second, is the only words that seem to have any importance. We're talking about really importance, like life-saving, perhaps helping you in the afterlife, spiritual, cosmic significance. In the city, nobody knows dog squat unless they got it from somebody else. Now the part that I pointed out even after that the most important thing anybody knows is what they tell themselves. We're back to the great contrast. They tell themselves, but they don't tell themselves that I told me that. They tell themselves that, hey, that's meaningful. I'm going to remember that. I'm going to live by that. I'm going to repeat that over and over while they're torturing me. But in the city, nobody can apparently come up with anything of any significance on their own. Nothing. If they could, there would be no books, collections of proverbs. Nobody would be quoted. Nobody. A large part of man's memory would atrophy. There'd be nothing to use it for. You would not say what anybody ever said to you. My mother told me not to do that. My father said, you should always. And then Buddha said, or it's right here, Abraham said, oh my, and I remember this. The real revolutionist, as crude as this may sound, and I'm not going to clean it up much more or stay with it much more, it's not as simple and direct as it sounds. But the real revolutionist would understand that the people back in the city where things are reasonable, sane, proper judgment is used, logic is the order of the day. Well, that and anti-logic, which is the same thing, it works out. Reason and insanity, but all appears to be linearly correct. That back in the city, where people say that they need observations to formulate some real idea, to come up with hypotheses that are workable and defendable, that must be based upon their own observations, he knows that that is not true, because he knows it's not true in him. Up until the point that he begins to make some life for himself, some conscious life out in the bush, he understands that up until this point, up to the point that there's kind of a stage of initial ignition in your nervous system, and you know that there's been a jolt and I can't ever really go back anymore. Not just imagining that you now have found the home and how much fun it is, and you hope someday I don't really get mad and deranged and just turn around and say, get out of here, because you'd really hate that. It'd take you a while to adjust, and you like showing up here. I'm talking about when the jolt has happened, and you molecularly are not the same. After such a basic experience, whatever else it may mean besides that, a real revolutionist, a person that's undergone some change, then understands that up until that point, he had never observed anything. He is like everybody else in the city, believing that all knowledge has got to be in some way. Hypotheses, all the way to knowledge has got to be based, if it's going to be correct, meaningful, upon personal observation. And he understands up until now, up until just last night, I personally had never observed anything. Nothing. Everything I knew, I read in Reader's Digest. Everything I knew seemed to have been whipped into my DNA, into my mother's womb before I was born. And what has always passed for the environment, education, experience. And to me it seemed like it was like these cards on that game show, Wheel of Fortune, and they're all blank, and all somebody's got to do is the young lady walk up there and touch it, and the letter turns around and exposes what the letter was. If there is any validity to the idea of environment, which there's not, but if there's any, it's as though all this was here and Vanna White suddenly, periodically, touches a certain letter, and there I am. Here I am, I believe I'm such and such, I believe I'm a Jew, a Catholic, I believe I'm male, I believe I'm white, I believe I'm Irish, I believe I'm black, I believe I'm alive, I believe I'm smart, I believe I'm dumb, I believe I'm a nice guy, I believe I'm terrible. Up until now, the real revolutionists would know, I have never observed anything, and neither has anybody else, or they would not ever quote anyone. The only thing that they would know is what they know, and it would be, into at least the fourth dimension, what everybody back in the city, including scientists, believe by such ideas as, I will formulate no hypotheses unless it is based upon my personal observation. It is patently not true. No one has ever, more or less, just in general, nobody's ever observed anything. They haven't. If you had observed something before now, hell, you would have learned something, right? And in the city, nobody's learned anything. They've learned this. Half the people in the world disagree with me. Half the time out in the field, I feel like I'm set upon. And about half the time, I feel like I'm the setter upon her. How about, what would it be? Potential revolutionist motto number 19. If it works, use it. That's not all. That was easy. The tricky part is, if a real revolutionist uses it, it will work. Yes, but Mr. Charlie. Yes, but Jehovah. Yes, but Swami so-and-so. Tell me exactly what to do. Should I absolutely give up all meat, or could I, every now and then, could I have a McDonald's? Should I keep trying to follow this other person around? They said that they would like to break off the relationship, and yet I feel like that there is some cosmic urge in me that this is my soulmate, but they say they don't really want to have anything to do with me right now. Should I just ignore that and go ahead and follow them around? Exactly. Should I or should I not? Is there such a thing as faith healing? Should I go to a doctor, or should I try to take up faith healing? I mean, just tell me what to do. I trust you. Tell me what to do. If you know what you're doing, it doesn't matter. Any hypothesis is all right. If you know what you're doing, then you can start off where most of you, or a lot of you, laughed when I said if the real revolutionist, he could use as a motto, if it works, use it, which would sound, even in the city, as some sort of perhaps enlightened, capitalistic, up-to-date, new age form of, although I guess I'm twisting some of the connotations myself, certain form of new age pragmatism. Situation ethics, maybe, situation intelligence, situation hypotheses. Instead of worrying about some overall philosophy, some systematic way of thinking or looking at things, just, if in any given case, if it works, use it. You know, to hell with what the ramifications are. I know. He was pointing out in the city they still believe in ramifications. But that's not it. That was just the beginning of it. In the city, I'm sure somebody said that before, if it works, use it. That's why I cautioned you that wasn't the end of it. The tricky part is, it's not just if it works, use it. Because if that's all it was, we're back to binary samples. If that's true, then the opposite's not true, right? Has to be. And that's not the case. Because if you know what you're doing, it's not just a matter if it works, use it. It's a matter that if you use it, if the right person uses it, you fucking make it work. Which is not the best way of putting it. I don't mean just the fucking word. If the right person uses it, it just works. It's not that it has to work, because it's not that it doesn't have to work. Flip a coin. Close your eyes so your tongue can't see and make a decision. Say, yeah. You got to do something that from the plantation, from the veranda view, if the boss himself, if the guides themselves were limited to or could convey, could deal with, feel hands, three-dimensional consciousness and view, they would look upon what was going on by these strange few feel hands, they would look at as being absolute insanity if they took any notice. That they would take up, let us say, some hobby that had apparently no pertinence to them. And if these veranda guides could read minds, as they used to say in the radio, they would even see that inside these few strange people I was calling revolutionists, they would see that what they're doing, by all that they could read of ordinary binary consciousness, was irrelevant. That the person doing it didn't give a rat's ass, as they say in some parts of the field. For those of you not familiar with the hallowed halls of academia, I once, I don't know what was Kyroots said this, or whether I heard that Kyroots said it. But there was somebody hanging around the bushes one time was going to do something. This is one example. I either heard this or I thought I heard it. Well, some guy, or maybe it was a woman, for absolutely no reason, decided to quit smoking, and then they heard, or they thought about it, and then they heard that it's an absolute fact that if you quit smoking, you lose weight. And so they quit smoking just so they could, that you gain weight, and they quit smoking and lost weight. For absolutely no reason. It's not true. It is not the way things operate. It was irrelevant, and yet I heard that somebody did it. And my impression, I may be second guessing if this happened, was they did it just, in a sense, if there was 4D such a thing, for 4D spite. Which is the height, or a splendid example, of the irrelevant. So that's the way things work, Aaron. There's nothing else going on. Maybe there's no good movies out that century. So that's the way things work. That if you have a habit such as this, you can't hardly stop it. You can't just up and stop it. And if you do, some of those bad side effects are that you gain weight. There is reality in the city. Proven medical facts, accepted medical facts. If that be true, fuck it. That's what that seemed to be the gist of what I picked up. I may be butchering this story, and I should have waited until Kyroot brought it up. But it was something along those lines. It makes enough sense to me. As I said before, it would be somebody with an abdomen that looked like a washboard deciding that since I can work in enough time in the morning, and since I can do it, that I can sit down in the floor and do, let's say, 1,000 sit-ups. And I've got no need to do it. I could be a poster boy for a hard stomach. Let's see, I'm going to start doing 3,000 sit-ups. There is no reasoning with such people. There is no logic to that. It's just frightening in its ramifications. People such as that are not to be trusted. There's no way that you can get any useful information. There's nothing that will support any idea, any theory, any hypotheses that you have ever heard of. And even worse than that, you cannot do any of it accidentally. Even if it sounds irrational to the ordinary field hands, which it does, you can't do it and not mean it. If you don't do it on purpose, you're not doing it. And there are people around that say things that are insane and irrational, but they don't know it, and they don't mean it. You're not doing this unless you know you're doing it and you intend to do it. Everybody else is part of the sampling process. As I continue to throw in, I guess it's verging on comments now rather than hints and me talking about other places off at 37 degrees at the green angle. But comments about there being an actual basis of meaninglessness to certain human activations of the contrast, that being the contrast itself that's of some importance. Let me also point out that it would be only a real revolutionist that could actually say what difference does it make anyway. Ordinary people cannot say correctly, that is. They cannot say, what difference does it make anyway? The only people that can say that are people who knows what difference it makes anyway. Now, back in the city, we all know that other people say it. People in your city say it. What difference does it make? Who cares? As long as you don't know what difference it makes, then you're just a run-of-the-mill field hand by saying, what difference does it make? Nobody can say that except people who understand what difference it does make. They're the only ones that can say it. It's not a matter of just some smart aleck being able to say, well, it's all meaningless. It would have to be a matter for a real revolutionist to explain, to show that the supreme importance is in the form. And a revolutionist could, to a band of enlistees, could at least attempt to show that the form is the only thing of any importance and that the content is meaningless. But this cannot be done in the city. It does not come about through some shorthand, smart aleck remark of nothing means nothing. It's all meaningless. Anybody that says it's all meaningless does not understand what the meaning is. Anyone who says, what difference does it make, doesn't understand that it does make a difference. If it didn't make a difference, they would not be forced to say it. There would not be half the field hands hollering, what difference does it make? In any case, when half of them holler out, let's all be Christians, and the other half hollers out, hey, who cares, what difference does it make? That shows that neither side understands, because it is not the content. It is the contrast. It would take someone such as I'm referring to as a real revolutionist to point out that the process is not meaningless, but the stuff processed is. That the vessel is irreplaceable. The vessel is inescapable, but the cargo is interchangeable. As long as I'm here, I could give you yet another definition of what a real revolutionist would be. Well, why not? Another shot would be someone to whom the relevant and the meaningless were equally overpriced, equally too short, equally too hot, equally too late, equally too large, equally ill-fitting, equally too tight. It would be someone to whom the meaningless and the relevant were equally equal. Kyroots, I believe, has asked something along these lines. If not, once I say it, Kyroots, I believe, has asked something along these lines. If not, once I say it, the rascal probably will. That would you be certain that a man who had read one book was smarter, was better off than a man who had not read any book? Are you sure? Would a man that read one book have then 100% more information, 100% more knowledge than a man who had read no book? Assuming, of course, I'm saying that a book was the only source, the only potential source of knowledge. would he be better off? Would he be more intelligent? Would he have more knowledge? Would he be more efficient than a man who had read no book? How can you be sure? Could you see that it would, in one sense, only be serving the purpose for giving a basis, not for a necessity of any knowledge, but to create the basis for contrast? That if you had read one book, you would have one sample. If there was such a thing as being worse than having no knowledge, that would be it. Because all you have set up is the potential for the ultimate necessity of a contrast. So if you read one book, you're going to read a second book. But to start off and say one book tells you anything, that's to say, well, one opinion would tell me something. One fact, just give me one fact, that's all I need, and I'll go from there. Yeah, but I know where you go. You go where everybody else goes. You go back out into the field, and you slave away, hollering at half the other people, disagreeing with half the other people. Something else they talk about in the city, maybe not as often as these other things I mentioned, which is, as me and the kid observed, that you people agree, they talk about these other things often enough. But something else that I have heard in the city is the term imaginary conflict. As though there could be mistakenly perceived positions, one party to another, one state to another, one city to another. Accidental wars, but imaginary conflicts. But we thought we were in conflict, and hell, as it worked out, we weren't really. Or we got there on a mistaken basis. I know Kyroots says he loves the city, and what a place, but I think we should actually love it. An imaginary conflict. Well, to begin with, conflict is conflict. Contrast is contrast. That would be as though one person's sight molecules would say, well, I got my choice of what I will wear today. This coat, I've got a red one, and I've got a red one. When it turns out the one was red and the other one was actually purple. Or the person says, well, I say I've got two possible coats to wear. I've got a red one and a purple one. And yet they're both red. Their molecules saw one of them as being purple. There is a great area there for discussion, thought, and of course conflict, which I don't have time to stop and go into. Conflict is conflict. The other part of the term imaginary conflict is, from one view, even more interesting, and that is the warning that I said would be valid in this strange other place that I was mentioning last time we met. When imagination should not be bad-mouthed. The belief in the city that in some way imagination is suspect, that imagination is, at least in part, the foe of good, solid knowledge. Just by and large, imagination, and we don't have time to stop and argue this, not some scientist trying to picture some new theorem trying to follow in his mind's eye some new line of mathematics. We're talking about what ordinary people in the city refer to as imagination. Imagination is the gateway to that other most important aspect of city life. This most important aspect as exemplified in one of the stories from last week that goes under the term of, oh, that reality. Without imagination, you would not have this all-important contrast that everyone has. You just never knew the term for it. Oh, that reality. Without imagination, you would have no perception of that reality. You would not be conscious. How about in the city? Another area that all of you find of interest. How about the critics? Can you imagine a critic who never mentioned the name of any other artist other than the one under review? Contrarily, what are criticisms made up of? It's not normally noticed, and we're of course not here attacking the intellectual, artistic wherewithal in the city because they have none. But all critics, all the way if they're writing for a high school newspaper, or they're the most respected contemporary critic up in the Great White Way in Manhattan. No one ever notices this, but they would be lost unless they could continually refer to, well, the certain monkish influences here, a certain Ellingtonian veneer to this would-be jazz suite. I hear certain Schoenbergian echoes in other fields of saying the use of color, Monet-ish in its intent. Do I see the juxtaposition of line and form being chaotic? Do I not hear calling us from the 20s the soft painting sounds of a Chagall? All right, now if we stopped right quick and we were dealing with life as it appears to go in the city, you could say, and they could say, wait a minute, you're making a cheap attack on our readers. How are they going to know when I say, all right, I'm reviewing, here in this paper, I'm reviewing a brand new album by this guy that nobody's ever heard of. His first album, playing jazz piano, it's written here, his arrangements and his group, he's got a quartet, and I'm telling you, much of what he does just strikes a note to me, it is Thelonious Monk revisited. Now, I don't mean he's a complete rip-off of Monk, but how can I describe it to my readers without making reference to somebody they already know? As the kid would say, bullshit. You missed it. You missed it, you missed it, you missed it. You might as well be living in the city. It's not for the benefit of their readers. It's not that that's not true. It's irrelevant. It's the contrast. How could you have a critic who could review an artist of any kind? By artist, this would be a war, a nation, a love affair, a painting, a book. What critic could review it and never mention another name except the artist, the person being reviewed? An unnatural critic, a revolutionary perception, a revolutionary understanding. The critics, I'm saying this with a capital C now, we're not just talking about the music or the art of the theater critics in the newspaper, of course. We're talking about the critical faculties of your people inside of Brunhilde. What can the critic do without contrast? It's obvious that Mr. So-and-so has spent, probably well spent, many hours, if not years, listening to the Duke and the kind of orchestral textures that Ellington was experimenting with in the 30s and the 40s and even up to his death. And it's obvious that this young artist has tried to expand upon it. It's contrast, it's contrast. What did that tell you? You've listened to Ellington, and you can say, oh, it sounds something like him. Who knows whether it does? Who cares whether it does? It cannot be proven. You do not know it. By reading the review, you don't know any more than you did. Other than the fact that in the city, everything sounds like everything else. other than the fact that in the city you can't hear anything if it's just once. You can't hear one sound. You couldn't hear one piece by Duke Ellington and be a music critic. You can't hear one piece of music by anybody and understand music. You can't hear one note and say that you know what music is. What appears to be the criticism is the continuing absolute requirement that there be contrast. A revolutionary critic, when I was asking you what kind could do it without reference to anybody else's name other than the person being reviewed, you would have somebody who could see without the limitations of contrast. You would have, to return to myself and quote me from earlier this evening, you would have the ability to see, to perceive, to implement that for which there was no natural inner models extant in you. You could see that which had no contrast. You could see that did not linearly follow from everything that you had been told, from everything that you had seen, everything you had felt, everything that everybody in the city, everything that everybody working in the fields on your team and the other team, all put together, everything that they'd ever thought about, en masse, everything they'd ever felt, everything they'd ever theorized, you put it all together, and there is no way in the world that would have led you to see this. None. You could hear new music, you could see new paintings, and I'm not talking about on the wall, and I'm not talking about coming off a phonograph record. You could see fresh data, you could see information that had no historical precedent. You could see new theorems not based upon experience. You could see new facts that were completely foundless. Another definition of fresh data would simply be that which has no contrast. It would have to be that you were beyond the two samplings of things either making sense or being nonsense. If they're either one, they're useless. Remember, in the city, what people believe is impossible is impossible. If people believe that they cannot do something, they cannot do it. And it is believed. They weren't taught it. They did not pick it up from the plantation owners. They didn't pick it up from their parents. They didn't pick it up from the other field hands. But as long as they believe that I cannot critique, I cannot understand anything without reference to somebody else's name, there is no way that I can criticize, review, study this painting, this literature, this idea, this theorem, this life, without mentioning somebody else's name. Yes, this favorably reminds me of so-and-so. Now in the city, from a certain revolutionary viewpoint, if there was degrees of danger for someone trying to do this, the biggest danger is you want to compare it to me. Not me, you. Well, what this reminds me of, is a certain aspect of myself. I could have done it. I dreamed about doing it. I may do it. I think I did it in another life. I could do it better if I wanted to. If I had any interest in this field, I could do it better than this. A favorable comparison, some kind of comparison. What do I know? What can I see? What can I think? Without making reference to some contrast, some comparison. As Mr. Charlie would say, some conflict. Can you see any possible use for this on a personal, internal level? The fact that no one can be a critic and simply review the artist apparently being reviewed, can do that without mentioning somebody else's damn name. Well, Jesus told me to do it. My mother told me I should. My father said, well, I've always believed that, well, I can just feel. I just feel that this is what a person should do. From a certain revolutionary viewpoint, and of course I'm being funny and entertaining as I can, as much as possible, and this is sham sarcasm. But to have to refer to somebody else, to say, well, I believe such and such is true, because it reminds me of something I read that Thelonious Monk said. It reminds me of a chant that I heard Duke Ellington used to do right before shows. It reminds me of a philosophy, a spiritual insight that I am sure Picasso muttered once between mistresses. I know they're words to live by, and I can tell you where I got them. Can you see any possible use internally for trying to find a place wherein you could review, you could survey a new gallery, new paintings, new music, and you could review it, you could perceive it while making no reference to anyone else's name? How? As long as it's meaningful, you've got to. There is no way out. See if you can follow this. I'll throw it in even if you can't, and we'll press on. The old idea of conspiracies going on, if you move up to another level, if we get out on the veranda with the plantation, with the guides, from a higher view, can you perceive that what they would look down and see that out in the field they'd be calling conspiracy, that the bosses would look down and find it to be very efficient, proper working coordination? That the straw bosses somewhere, if there was what people believe are conspiracies, the boss would see that, well, the straw bosses got together in what from below appears to be a nefarious scheme, deception. From a higher view, the boss would look down and think, how efficient, and would see nothing at all questionable about it. But all you've got to do, let's say that there's a level, let's say the field hands working, all of us toiling in the city, earning our keep. And some of the field hands at that level say there are conspiracies going on, they're tricking us into working, they're making us work for less wages, or every time we get a raise, they come up with a sham depression. There's some kind of conspiracy and deceit going on from secret powers. Life is not fully in our hands. Whatever the circumstance that somebody believed they saw, they believe they observed it. There was some observable phenomenon on which to base this hypothesis that there is a conspiracy. All you've got to do is go up, not down, go up to a higher level, to a more complex level, and literally, if there was the kind of conspiracy that I was describing from ground level, all you got to do is go higher, and the boss would look down, and he would see that same situation, if it existed. He would see it as being an admirable, efficient manner of cooperation among the workers. As always, I ask you, can you see any possible use for that? It is only from ground level, it's only from in the fields that what is called a conspiracy of any sort can be seen as being nefarious. From a higher view, it is the height of efficiency. What have I been hinting and talking about for the last 3 times we've been meeting? Yeah, I know. Don't say you. God only knows. The more confusing, the more complex, the more conflicting it seems to be, the more what is it? Efficient. Efficient. I want to mention something on the public tape to those who might see the public tape, and that is, we've changed paragraphs, people, of don't give up the dream. And I have mentioned this before. I point out that everybody has the dream. That is, you had a dream. You had a dream in boys' cases, since I have some personal familiarity with that. It's like they can go through a stage and you might have dreamed about being a famous ball player, and you might have apparently outgrown that about the age of puberty. Overt horniness. But at some fairly young age you might have apparently shed that one, lost it, but then you and women, to some degree, all had the dream that stayed. I want to point out to you, literally, as much as anything is literally true on the 3D level, there is an individual biological basis for the dream in every person. It is not something that you have picked up. It is not something that has been in any way instilled in you. You did not accidentally pick up the dream that you wanted to be a great concert violinist, that you wanted to be an author whose works were read and respected far and wide, that you wanted to be a great long-distance runner, an artist, a ballerina, whatever. There is an absolute biological, I have to go back to the contrasting dichotomies to try and point to it verbally, there is a biological basis in everybody individually for the dream, whatever it was in your case. You should not give it up. And once you have biologically again been entrapped in what I can easily signpost as being, in women's case, usually getting pregnant, becoming a mother, and in men's cases, usually becoming a father or accepting the responsibility of being a father. In most cases, that is the end of the dream in the city. Not that their yellow circuits do not ever recall it anymore, but as far as the person is concerned, the dream is over. That's it. You should not give up the dream. At the very worst case scenario that you might seem to be going through now, you should look at it as the dream is temporarily on hold. But over, never, never, never. Just, I'm telling you for a reason, do not give up the dream. Trust me. Just refuse. And don't let any people talk to you anywhere. Don't let anybody make fun of you. Don't let anybody say, oh, well, what's the difference? There is a difference. There is a molecular, there is a biological, there is a chemical difference. Do not give it up. Do not admit you gave it up. Do not be cynical. Do not be snide about it. Do not be defensive about it. Just don't even discuss it. Nobody knows the dream that is your dream except you. Nobody fully knows it. Nobody fully feels it except you. Don't discuss it. Don't throw out the pearls before you know what. Road hogs. At the very most, at the very least, at the very worst, the feeling should be that for reasons really beyond your control, and I don't want to go into them, and you surely don't want to go into them, the dream seems to be temporarily on hold. I'll grant that. But it is not over, and I have not given up the dream. I think I'll stop. I'll give you a closing one. all of you should find your own way, and maybe someday I'll be a little more specific, at least with a suggestion, but this should cover it, is all of you should daily be in some way, at least once, you should actually do it where you know you did it. You should thank life for what it's done to you. Well, all right, for what it's made available to you, for having you to the bushes born. That you just, whatever it takes, thanks life. Or be able to damn it wholeheartedly. Remember I said daily, so that I don't mean that you're stuck with either one or the other forever. The last part's really was attempted humorous relief here, which succeeded a little. But you should be thanking life. Once a day, you ought to say, thanks, life. Really. Or as I said, if that is not appropriate, it is the same thing if you can wholeheartedly. Damn it. Same thing. It's just easier with most people to smile doing one or the other. Whereas a real gone revolutionist could smile in either case. But then that gets into areas that I'm not sure we'll ever have time to do, and that is the correct way to curse. Every now and then I throw in, I've never pointed out, but I just throw in little bits and pieces here during my tapings. But you got to know how to do it. It is a true art, and it has no real contrast. And you really have no great reference points other than you can use the same old words everybody else uses that still serves the purpose. But it's always the content is irrelevant. The form, the purpose, not the organization. It is the vehicle of damnation, of widespread, almost uncontrollable, while directly under your power, cursing. It is the process, it is the form. Or it is, on the other hand, being able to truly say, thanks, life, for what's happened, who I am, where I am, as though you had a choice. But thanks. I'm aware enough of it now, I've gone far enough that day by day I can remember and I actually feel it. I say thanks. Not to an old man, not to my father's imagined Jehovah's or gods or Allahs, because I've got more of a feel that it's life itself. It's just growing. In some way I find myself in a certain part of life that grows at a different rate of speed than everybody else around me. Thanks. Doesn't matter whether you believe life hears you, you got no other name for it, and all that's not true. Thanks. Or else, you whore-faced goddamn mother son of a fucking...